Hello and welcome to my tutorial on building a visual novel UI system. This tutorial is aimed more towards beginners in Godot, but even if you're more experienced, feel free to tag along and go into brain off copy and paste mode. In this tutorial, we will use Dialog Manager 3, which is a text interpreter system built by the absolute gigachat NathanHoad, which basically handles all the file work and internals for us so that we can concentrate on making it convenient and pretty to look at, but also with the usual features that you expect from a visual novel game, like portraits and animated character models, etc. Click the link on screen to get to Nathan's channel. He has a ton of tutorials about the system, and when you're there, feel free to leave a like and subscription to his channel. What you see in the background is what we are going to build today. A test dialog I created for my hot spring management game, Kimono Springs. So, here we are. Kimono Springs open in a freshly updated Godot on version 4.4. Yikes. So far, nothing looks too broken, but update anxiety always kills me. I'm praying to the code gods that everything works. Let's start by importing Nathan's system from the asset library. It's called Dialog Manager 3, so hit install, and then we have to restart Godot. And after restarting Godot, we go to Project Settings and then go into Plugins and enable the plugin there. And it installed without a hitch and no errors. Fantastic! Now, obviously, just importing the system alone will not trigger any dialog. So the first step is to create a small function that actually displays something. So let's write a showDialog function. This function takes a dialog resource, a title string, and an array as parameters. The latter two are optional. Title should be obvious. Dialog resource tells the system which dialog file to play. And extra game states is basically to pass the system an array of globals to read and modify game states from within the dialog. So we create a new balloon, which is how the system calls its text UI, and preload and instantiate the balloon scene. And then we add it to the scene tree and call the start function, passing all the parameters. Now, obviously, we don't have a dialog file to play yet, so we need to create one. And for this, I added a dialog folder to my game. And then we click on the dialog tab here and click on the little plus to create a new dialog and save it into the folder. And you can see that the system automatically gives you some example text. Now we go to the main ready function of our game to trigger the example dialog there. But you can trigger it from basically everywhere. It's just how I do it in this tutorial. So let's use showDialog, and then we enter our dialog file UID, and when you're done, run your project. Awesome. Okay, time to customize the thing. There are a few features I'd like to add. First, I want to display a portrait, obviously. This portrait will be optional, because all important characters in the game will have an animated 2D model. So those won't need portraits, but customers or side characters might need some. Also, I want the portrait and the 2D model associated with the speaker to be able to run animations by adding tags to the dialog. Tags can be added by using square brackets and a hashtag like this. So, for example, if I write hashtag sad, then the portrait or the animated model will play the sad animation of the character. Obviously, we will also update the graphics themselves, so let's start by making a copy of the example balloon and update the visuals to use my own UI assets. Alright, now the buttons and the UI have the correct textures. But there are still a few problems, because, for example, whenever the button is clicked, the response happens immediately and the pressed state of the button is never visible. But this is easy to fix by changing the event in Nathan's code. So we go into the script of the response buttons and scroll all the way down and change the pressed statements to released statements. And now, the button should have a nice visual feedback when getting pressed. Also, by the way, if your button looks weird when focused and doesn't look like the texture specified in the pressed style theme here, then you just need to add an empty style box for the focus texture to fix that. Now, obviously, I don't want my buttons to overlap like this, so we go into the response node in the scene tree and adjust the separation argument in the constants here. Okay, this is looking nice and clean. One more problem I have here is that the button text does not allow BB code. So what I will do is that I will hide the text from the button and delegate the text to a rich text label. So let's create a rich text label here. We need to hide the original text caption of the button, so let's make all the font colors transparent. And now when we test it out, we see that the original text is gone, but we still need to transfer the text information over to the rich text label. So we go back to the response script and search for the part in which the text is assigned to the button, and then simply add a line in which we change the text of the child as well. If the button is not clickable anymore, then this is because rich text labels can react to mouse input, so we have to set the click mode to ignore. Alright, after adjusting the button textures a bit more to make them blend better with the rest of the UI, it's time to spice it up a bit with animations. And in my case, I want a little rescaling animation of the buttons when they show up. And the problem here is that the response node inherits from the container class. And containers rob you of your ability to adjust the scaling of child nodes directly. Honestly, the easiest way to fix this, in my opinion, is to not even bother at all and simply put all the textures outside of the responsibility of the button. So let's create a 9-patch rect as a child of the button and adjust the visuals and textures to match the original button. When you do this, make sure to use Anchor Mode Full Rect to make the newly added image dynamically adjust in size depending on the size of the original button. For example, when the button has 2 lines of text instead of 1. Then we go into the button normal texture and simply make it invisible. We don't want to remove it because that would make the button default back to the original black theme. Also, we don't want to replace it with an empty texture because that messes up the container scaling. Instead, we just set the modulate of the texture to an invisible alpha channel. Okay, perfect. Now we can only see the new 9-patch rect and the original button is transparent. Let's do the same for the hover texture of the button and make it invisible by default. And let's not forget to also make the original button hover texture transparent. Also click Show Behind Parent in the layout settings of both textures so that the response text renders above them. Next, we add a little script to the button and add the visibility logic and mouse events for the button. Use exports to access the 2 nodes and then simply connect the button signals to functions that hide or shop the... Why does it say shop in my script? To show the corresponding images. Actually, let's change this to button down so that the arrow key controls don't accidentally trigger this function. Also, toggle the check mark key pressed outside of button to on so that when the player clicks the button, it moves the cursor outside, it doesn't cause unwanted bugs. And also, don't forget to actually fill the exports with the correct nodes. And now we have a working button with outsourced textures. Awesome! Just to clarify, I did not bother doing the same for the press texture because I don't need fancy animations on that. But if you want a rescaling animation for a pressed button as well, then simply add another image for the pressed button and set it to visible inside the onPress function we added. Also, if you're wondering why I used focus events instead of mouse events, then this is because the dialog system is set up to work with both keyboard and mouse controls, and the focus events will cover both input types. Okay, time to add a cool little animation. First, we add another export for the rich text label. And second, we create a tween as a child of the button and adjust the tween property scale of the 2 textures. Keep in mind to set it to parallel because by default, property changes will be executed one after another. Don't forget to set the starting values. And also, if you want to see the animation correctly, because we want the scaling to happen from the center and not from the left, we have to set the pivot point for the textures to the center of the texture. Next, I want to fade in the label of the button after the rescaling is done. So first we reset the parallel property back to false and then adjust the self-modulate alpha channel of the label. Okay, the animations are working. However, I am not done here, because I want the buttons to pop up one after another. So let's add a little time interval in front of our property tweeners. And depending on the position in the scene tree, which we can get with the getIndex function, we adjust the length of the interval. Alright, that looks better. But I still don't like how the animation transitions, so let's change that to a signed function. However, there's another little problem. You might not have noticed because the text dialog is too short to notice, but Dialog Manager hides all the buttons until the entire text has finished typing. So a part of our animation will play while the buttons are still invisible. To fix that, we need to postpone our animation until the buttons actually appear. So we put the entire animation block into a separate function and then make our function listen to the visibility changed signal. And we are very happy. Look at this. It's insane how much such little animations contribute to the feel of a game. Anyway, let's continue with the chat panel itself. Basically, I want a similar animation to the responses. We gotta make sure to adjust the pivot point of the dialog box to the center of the panel, or otherwise the scaling animation won't play correctly. But before we can start animating, we first want to create a copy of the example balloon script and replace the script of the balloon. And this way, we don't have to make adjustments in the add-ons files directly and can modify our own version instead. Let's quickly add 2 more exports for the portrait and the panel, and then we can look for the start function and add another tween there. And in there we basically do the same that we did for the response boxes. We adjust the scale of the box and the modulate property of the text and portrait, etc. Also, we fix a little inconsistency with the class name and the node name in the main balloon, so let's rename them. Wonderful! I really like the look and feel of the UI now. Now the only thing remaining is adding the animation tag feature to our UI, so let's continue with that. We start by adding a new script to the main control that holds the character portrait. Next, we add an export to access that image, and don't forget assigning it. We also want a string called current character that is by default empty. And now we can create a function that handles all the display stuff for the portrait. I call it update, and it takes the current dialog line object from the dialog manager as a parameter. Next, we want a show and hide function for our portrait. In the hide function, we simply make the portrait invisible, and in the show function, we make it visible again. Okay, I think this was obvious, but well. However, in the show function, we also want to load in the new portrait. And here it depends on how the file structure is organized. In my case, I store all my character portraits inside a character folder with different subfolders that have the character names. So I simply load in the first part of the path, followed by the name of the character, and we need to remember case sensitivity here, and then follow it up by the portrait naming convention that is the same for all characters. And now all we have to do is add some logic to the update function. When the character changes between the last and the new dialog line, the portrait will be hidden and then shown again for the new character. But before we can test it out, we need to go back to the main balloon script and scroll all the way down to the apply dialog line function. And there we trigger our portrait update right before the next dialog line is triggered. Okay, I changed the example dialog a little bit to use the names of my characters, and this is how it looks like in the game now. Awesome! Now, obviously, we don't want the engine to throw an error if the character has no portrait file, so let's add a condition to check for the path first before loading it in. Now that we have the static portraits working, we can actually add emotions based on tags. And for the sake of this video, I went ahead and created a smiling variant of the portrait. And I could potentially just add a new image layer here and then code the texture change manually, but honestly, that would make it way too inflexible and hard-coded for my taste. So instead, we will use scenes and allow every character to have its own exclusive node architecture and use animation players to trigger the states of the scene. Architecture. Goddammit, German. So let's create a new 2D scene inside this characters folder, and we call it dynamic portrait. And inside the scene, we add an animation player. The name really doesn't matter for now. I also copy and paste the static image we already have in our main balloon into the scene. And next, I duplicate the image and replace the texture with the smile overlay texture. And I think you can already see where this is going. We open up the animation player and add a new animation. Let's call it Smile. Then in the inspector, I click the little key next to the self-modulate property and hit Create. Let's reduce the animation length to 0.3 and move the keyframe to the end of the track. Let's add a second animation called Default, and in this animation we basically reset the face overlay back to invisible. And for the default animation, let's add a keyframe for the self-modulate that is fully invisible at the end of the track. And for the final step, we go to the animation player and set the blend time to 0.3 seconds to have a smooth transition between the animations. If we now switch between the two animations, the character will transition smoothly between the states. Obviously, we can make it a bit more fancy by actually having moving parts and the bone structure, etc. But for now, this is satisfying. So let's go back to our balloon script. We yoink our static portrait out and instead add our newly created dynamic portrait scene to the portrait via code. We start by changing the file path to dynamic portrait tscn here. And if the file exists, instead of just loading the file into a texture, we instead instantiate it as a scene. Obviously, static portrait no longer exists, so let's remove it and instead add current actor as a new variable. We assign the instantiated scene to the current actor and then add it as a child to the portrait node in the scene tree. Next, we go into the update function and actually pass the tags of the dialog line as a parameter to the showActor function. And then finally, we can loop through the tags, and for each tag, we check the dynamic portrait scene for animation players. And for each animation player, we check if it has an animation that corresponds with the current tag, and if we find one, we play that animation. We need to clean up the hide actor function, and instead of just hiding the image that no longer exists, by the way, we simply destroy the edit node. And remember to check if the node exists before destroying it to avoid errors. And now if I add the smile tag to a line of Mikisa, we can actually see her smiling in the game. Win's portrait is no longer visible because she doesn't have a dynamic portrait yet. So this is a nice check to see if a missing resource crashes the game or not, and it doesn't. So awesome. But wait, we missed something. Nikisa's animation didn't reset back to default in this line. And this is because currently we only call the showActor function when the character changes. Obviously, we also want to update the animations every time the text change. So let's move the loop in which we find animations to play into another function. And instead just call that function in showActor. And now we can just add the playActor function to the update in an else block, and we can see the animations play properly. Because the playActor function is now separate from the showActor function, we need to guarantee that the actor exists. So let's add a little condition here. Alright, almost done. Final addition to our visual novel design. I want to also display a big character model on screen and not just a portrait. And here's the fun part. We don't even have to do much to achieve that, because we can just reuse the script that we used for the portrait. So I just duplicated the portrait node and called it center stage. The script is shared among both nodes, so we don't have to do anything there. Next, I will add another export for the balloon script for the duplicated node, and also another update call below the one for the portrait. And as you can see, we now have two portrait instances running at the same time. Now obviously we want the center stage to reference a different scene and not the portrait, so we can no longer hardcode the file path to look for. Instead, we will just add a string as a parameter to the update function that defines the file name that we look for. And then we change the script to use that file name. Okay, to test it out, we need another animated model, and luckily I still have an old model of my OC that we can use to test the system, so I just throw that in real quick. Now obviously the model needs to be renamed so that it matches the parameter that we pass to the showActor function. And now you can see me drink tea. This model actually has two animation players, one for the body and one for the eye animations. So the eye blink animation is basically an auto loop, and you can make an animation play automatically by clicking the little A button here. Also, unlike the portrait, the animated model is supposed to play behind the UI, so let's edit the z-index to a negative number. I also added a portrait for her, and now we can do the final test run and see if everything works correctly. And for this purpose, I will write a new dialogue. And with my OC enjoying her tea, we finally made it to the end of this video. Anyway, that's it. See you again in the next video. Toodles!